Imagine this. Before you stands a man who is handsome, intelligent, charismatic, and a law student with a bright future. A rising name in politics. Someone who can easily influence everyone around him. A man whom women instantly trust. Now, imagine that this very same man is one of the most cold-blooded, manipulative, and brutal serial killers America has ever seen. This isn't a movie script. This is the true story of Ted Bundy, a man who won his victims' trust by playing the role of a helpful stranger, who managed to escape from high-security prisons twice, and who wore a lawyer's robe in his own murder trial under the glare of the spotlight. So, how did this golden boy, who blended perfectly into society, transform into a monster that stole the lives of dozens of innocent people? Let's take a journey behind that brilliant mask, into the darkest corridors of the human mind. It all began with the picture of a perfect American family, or at least, that's what outsiders were meant to see. Born on a cold November day in 1946, in a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Cowell began his life under the shadow of a great lie. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, due to social pressure and the shame she felt for her family's tarnished name, could not tell her baby that she was his mother. Instead, the people introduced to Ted for years as his mother and father were, in fact, his grandmother and grandfather. His mother, Louise, took on the role of his older sister. This was a stick of dynamite placed at the foundation of a child's sense of identity and trust. Ted grew up unaware of the most fundamental truth of his existence, and this secret created an irreparable crack in his psychological development. The Cowell home, while appearing to be a respectable family residence, from the outside, was a place of turmoil behind closed doors. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, though a respected man in his community, was a tyrant at home. Strong testimonies exist that he was a racist, bigoted, and violent man. He was known to abuse animals, swing the family cat by its tail, and inflict both physical and psychological violence on Louise and Ted. In this toxic atmosphere, Ted breathed fear and instability instead of love and security. It is told that once, at the tender age of 3, he placed all the knives from the kitchen around his sleeping aunt's bed. When his aunt awoke in terror, she saw little Ted standing at her bedside, staring at her with empty eyes. While this incident was often dismissed as childhood curiosity, it was a terrifying sign of how early his future violent tendencies were beginning to sprout. Ted's childhood was marked by social isolation and a strange introversion. He was described as weird by his peers. Instead of joining in games like other children, he preferred to be alone, living in his own dark world. During this period, he developed a pathological interest in magazines containing violence and pornography. The crime scene photos in detective magazines, particularly the images of brutally murdered women, became the cornerstones of his developing fantasy world. For him, these images were not just a matter of curiosity, but also a growing source of sexual arousal. In the mind of this outwardly quiet and harmless-looking boy, a dangerous world was being built, one that objectified women and fueled a desire to dominate them. He experienced one of the greatest peers shocks of his life when a cousin called him a bastard, and he subsequently found his own birth certificate. When he learned that the woman he had known as his sister was actually his mother, and the people he had called mum and dad were his grandparents, his world came crashing down. This discovery completely destroyed his already weak sense of identity and his trust in people. He felt deceived, betrayed, and rootless. This feeling of betrayal would become one of the main sources of the deep anger and mistrust he would feel towards women for the rest of his life. The resentment and anger he felt toward his mother would eventually transform into a hatred projected onto all female figures. In his teenage years, he developed a perfect mask to hide this internal chaos. He paid extreme attention to his appearance, always making sure to be neat and well-groomed. He was intelligent, had strong oratorical skills, and could easily manipulate people. He began studying psychology at the University of Washington. His choice of major was no coincidence. Learning how the human mind worked was, for him, a way to control others more effectively. During his university years, he met a wealthy and beautiful young woman named Stephanie Brooks. Stephanie was a turning point in Ted's life. She represented everything Ted aspired to be: status, wealth, beauty, and social acceptance. However, their relationship failed due to Ted's insecurity and inferiority complex. Stephanie grew tired of Ted's lack of ambition and immaturity, and broke up with him. This rejection was another traumatic blow for Ted. Stephanie's abandonment reinforced his feelings of worthlessness, but Ted did not see this as a defeat. He saw it as a vow of revenge. He decided to reinvent himself. He worked ambitiously to get into law school, volunteered for the Republican Party, and quickly rose through the ranks, obtaining important positions like advising the governor. He was now a more charismatic, successful, and powerful man. With this new identity, he found Stephanie again years later and made her fall in love with him all over again. Just as they began making wedding plans, Ted abruptly, and without any explanation, left her. This was the cold and cruel revenge for the rejection he had suffered years before. He was no longer the victim but the one in control. This event was the clearest proof that he saw people, especially women, as pawns to be used and discarded to satisfy his own ego. The mask now fit his face perfectly, and the monster behind it was just waiting for the right time to emerge from the darkness and begin its hunt. The traumas of his childhood, the rejections, and the emptiness within him were the first steps on the path that would turn him into one of America's most horrific serial killers. The psychology of Ted Bundy is like the darkest corridors of a labyrinth. Trying to understand him requires confronting the most disturbing aspects of human nature. Bundy was the embodiment of many dark definitions in psychological literature: narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and most importantly, a psychopath. But even these labels are not enough to fully explain the monstrosity behind his actions. His mind was a dangerous combination of a deep void, an insatiable desire for possession, and an absolute need for control. One of Bundy's core characteristics was his complete lack of empathy. He did not see his victims as human beings. They were objects, property to be used to fulfill his dark fantasies. The language he used when speaking of his victims in his confessions reveals this horrifying truth. He referred to them as cargo or material, showing not a shred of concern for the pain or fear they experienced. The only thing that mattered to him was the thrill of the hunt, the absolute dominion he established over his victim, and the rituals he performed on the body afterward. This is the most distinct feature of psychopathy, the inability to understand or connect with the feelings of others. Bundy was a master at mimicking the emotions of others. He could perfectly play the role of a charismatic, helpful, and understanding man, but this was merely a hunting technique used to achieve his goal. His narcissism was one of his greatest motivations, and at the same time, one of his greatest weaknesses. He saw himself as superior to everyone, more intelligent, and untouchable. This grandiose attitude helped him both to commit his crimes and to evade capture for a long time. He looked down on the police and FBI agents, believing he was mocking them. This unshakable faith in his own intelligence made him incredibly bold. He did not hesitate to abduct his victims in broad daylight from crowded places, because he never believed he would be caught. However, this narcissism was also what led to his downfall. His decision to fire his lawyers and represent himself during his trial was a display of his narcissistic ego, feeding on media attention and the spotlight. He saw the courtroom as his personal stage, but this stage paved his way to the electric chair. The most terrifying element in Bundy's mind was the gradual blurring of the line between fantasy and reality. The fantasies filled with violence and pornography that began in his childhood eventually became a refuge for him. He escaped from the feelings of inadequacy and rejection he felt in real life by retreating into this fantasy world. In this world, he was powerful, he was in control, and women could not resist him. But at a certain point, fantasies were no longer enough. The desire to experience the scenarios he imagined in his mind became an irrepressible urge. His first murders were attempts to bring these fantasies to life. Each murder provided new material for the next fantasy, and this horrific cycle pushed him to kill more. He was both the director and the lead actor of a movie he created, and his victims were nothing more than extras in this horror film. Psychologists explain Bundy's actions with the motive of possession. He didn't just kill his victims, he wanted to own them. The acts of abduction, rape, and murder were only the first steps of this desire for possession. He found true gratification in the time he spent with the body after the murder. He kept his victims' bodies for weeks, sometimes months. He would dress them, apply makeup, talk to them, and even engage in sexual acts with the corpses. Necrophilia. This was his moment of ultimate control. A living person could resist, fight back, or reject him. but a corpse was completely subject to his will. This was a kind of compensation for the rejection by Stephanie Brooks and the betrayal he experienced. In his childhood, now, no one could leave him, because he possessed both the life and death of his victims. The transformation of this dark psychology into a hunter began in early 1974 in Washington state. Linda Ann Healy, Georgianne Hawkins, Donna Gail Manson, Susan Runcourt, ... The list went on and on. They were all young, beautiful university students with long hair parted in the middle. Just like Stephanie Brooks, the turning point in Ted's life, Bundy was, consciously or unconsciously, hunting a prototype of the woman who had rejected him. Each victim was a part of the revenge he could not take on Stephanie. For him, this was a personal vendetta. The birth of the hunter was the inevitable result of the hatred, desire for control, and fantasies that had been fermenting in the darkest corridors of his psychology for years. Behind the mask of a successful, handsome, and intelligent law student living within society, one of the most cold-blooded and monstrous hunters America had ever seen had begun to select his victims, one by one. Ted Bundy was a monster, but his most dangerous weapon was not his claws or teeth. It was his charisma and his ability to manipulate people. To ensnare his victims, he used a method far more effective than brute force: trust. His modus operandi was built on brutally exploiting one of his prey's most basic instincts, the desire to help someone in need. Bundy did not appear before his victims as a threat, but as an attractive and polite stranger who needed help. This was the most telling sign of his demonic genius. His most well-known and frequently used trick was the broken arm or leg in a cast routine. He would typically put one arm in a sling, carry a few books or a bag, and ask his targeted young woman to help him carry his belongings to his car, always a Volkswagen Beetle. In the more innocent and trusting atmosphere of the 1970s, saying no to a handsome, well-dressed young man who clearly needed help was unthinkable for most women. When the victim, with good intentions, agreed to help him, she was actually walking into her own trap. The moment they reached the car, in that vulnerable instant, Bundy's helpful mask would fall. Suddenly, he would strike the victim's head with a lethal blow from a crowbar or iron rod he had concealed. This sudden and unexpected attack would incapacitate her before she had a chance to scream or resist. He would then quickly throw the unconscious victim into his car and take her to a secluded location he had scouted beforehand. Another effective method was impersonating an authority figure. Sometimes he would pose as a police officer, a firefighter, or a security guard. He exploited the natural respect and obedience people have for uniformed individuals. He could persuade a woman to come to his vehicle by telling her a suspicious person had been seen near her car, or that there was some danger. His confident speech and self-assured demeanor prevented his victims from questioning his false identity. This method was proof of how planned and organized a killer he was. He didn't just act on impulse. He planned his hunting scenarios down to the smallest detail. Bundy's genius also manifested in his victim selection and crime scene management. He typically targeted young university students who looked alike, with long, dark hair parted in the middle. This profile bore a striking resemblance to his first great love and the woman who left him, Stephanie Brooks. He often chose his victims from crowded places like campuses, shopping malls, or parks. This demonstrated his audacity and his narcissistic belief that he would never be caught. The summer of 1974 was the period when Bundy most terrifyingly demonstrated how masterfully he used these methods. On July 14th, Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle was teeming with people enjoying a sunny day. Bundy prowled the park that day like a true predator. With his arm in a sling, he introduced himself as Ted and asked for help loading his sailboat onto his car. Many young women approached him with suspicion and refused, but eventually, 23-year-old Janice OTT agreed to help him. Janice walked with Bundy to the parking lot and was never seen again. Horrifyingly, Bundy was not satisfied. Just 4 hours later, in the same park, using the same trick, he deceived 18-year-old Denise Natsland. He had managed to abduct 2 young women from a park filled with thousands of people in the middle of the day. This event was the first time police seriously considered the possibility that a single person could be responsible for multiple disappearances. A few witnesses mentioned a handsome man with his arm in a sling who said his name was Ted, and his bronze-colored Volkswagen. These were the first concrete clues to the killer's identity. Bundy was also extremely meticulous about not leaving evidence behind. He usually did not kill his victims in his car, but took them to a secondary crime scene where he would rape, torture, and murder them. These places were typically wooded, secluded areas that no one could easily find. After committing the murders, he went to great lengths to dispose of the bodies. He would bury them in deep graves or dump them in riverbeds. It is even known that he decapitated some of his victims and took their heads home to keep for a time. This was the most grotesque manifestation of his desire for possession. His efforts to destroy evidence left investigations fruitless for years. It was nearly impossible to find fingerprints, hair strands, or any DNA evidence at the scenes. He was not just a murderer, he was also a meticulous crime scene cleaner. The mask of the helpful stranger, his perfectly executed modus operandi, and his meticulousness in leaving no trace behind explained why Ted Bundy was able to evade justice for years and end the lives of dozens of young women. He was an invisible predator, blended into society. Although Ted Bundy saw himself as a perfect predator, his narcissism and increasing recklessness slowly caused the trap around him to tighten. The first steel jaw of that trap snapped shut unexpectedly in Utah in August 1975. Late one night, a patrol officer named Bob Haywood, in a suburb of Salt Lake City, noticed a suspicious Volkswagen. The vehicle had quickly turned off its headlights and tried to speed away upon seeing the police car. When Haywood stopped the car, he had no idea that the polite, clean-cut young man behind the wheel was Ted Bundy. Although Bundy gave calm and logical explanations for being in the area, Haywood's suspicions lingered. A search of the car revealed a chilling burglary kit, a crowbar, an ice pick, handcuffs, a ski mask, and rope. Though Bundy tried to explain them away as innocent items, he was now on the police's radar. This routine traffic stop was the first domino to fall. Bundy's name and photograph were now in the hands of the Utah police. The previous year, Carol Durange, who had managed to escape an abduction attempt from a shopping mall by jumping out of the car at the last second, had given police a description of her attacker. The assailant, who had identified himself as a police officer, had tried to handcuff her. When the police showed Bundy's photo to Carol, she identified him without hesitation. "That's the man." This identification was the beginning of the end for Bundy. He was arrested and tried for attempted kidnapping. He was confident and arrogant in court, but he was found guilty in the face of the evidence and Carol Durange's unwavering testimony, and was sentenced to prison. But this was not the end of Bundy's story. The state of Colorado had found evidence linking him to murders there, specifically the murder of Karen Campbell. Bundy was transferred to Colorado to stand trial. At the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, his narcissism and confidence in his own intelligence peaked here. Finding his lawyers inadequate, he requested to represent himself. His request was granted. This decision gave him the right to use the court library freely. In June 1977, during a moment when he was left alone in the library between hearings, Bundy made one of the most audacious moves of his life. He jumped out of a second-story window. After a fall of about 30 feet, he escaped with minor injuries and fled into the mountains. America was in shock. One of the country's most wanted men had escaped by jumping out of a courthouse window. A massive manhunt was launched. Hundreds of police officers, helicopters, and dogs scoured the mountainous terrain of Aspen. But Bundy was unprepared. He could not withstand the hardships of mountain life. Hunger and cold exhausted him. He stole cars and broke into a mountain cabin, but just 6 days later, he was recaptured, tired and disheveled. While this escape attempt magnified his legend, it was also proof of how reckless he could be. After his capture, he was transferred to a more secure prison in Glenwood Springs. But Bundy had no intention of giving up. He had learned from his first escape. This time, he was more patient and methodical. For months, he secretly worked on creating a hole in the ceiling of his cell with a hacksaw blade. He worked while other inmates were singing or showering to cover the noise. He lost weight so he could fit through the narrow opening. In the final days of 1977, taking advantage of the lax atmosphere of the Christmas holiday, he put his plan into action. He climbed through the hole into the ceiling crawlspace, made his way to an empty guard's room, put on the guard's clothes, and walked out the front door of the prison without anyone noticing. This was his second and much more successful escape. This time, he left no trace behind. By the time the police realized he was gone hours later, Bundy had already left the state. Now free, Bundy traveled to the other side of the country, Florida. Here, he began living under a new identity, Chris Hagen, but the monster inside him was too strong to be suppressed. Just a few weeks after his escape, in January 1978, Ted Bundy would carry out his most savage and bloodthirsty attack. He snuck into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in the middle of the night. In just 15 minutes, he brutally attacked 4 young women. He murdered Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman and beat the other 2 nearly to death. He didn't stop, even after leaving the sorority house, attacking another student a few blocks away. This massacre was a sign that Bundy had now completely lost control, that the violence in his fantasies had reached its peak. The trap had tightened. Bundy had been caught, but he had managed to escape its clutches twice. However, this arrogant freedom would be the beginning of his final and bloodiest act. Ted Bundy's bloody reign in Florida did not end with the Chi Omega massacre. The urge to kill within him was now growing uncontrollably, like an avalanche. Just a few weeks after this horror, he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from near her school. Kimberly was his youngest known victim. This act showed that Bundy had lost all consistency even in his victim profile, that he was now acting purely on primal instincts. The little girl's lifeless body was found weeks later in an abandoned pigsty. This was the final straw that caused public outrage. Florida was living in terror of an invisible phantom. But Bundy's end came, once again, through his own arrogance and a simple mistake. While driving a stolen car, he caught the attention of a police officer in Pensacola. When he ignored the order to stop, a short chase ensued, and Bundy was finally captured. At first, he refused to reveal his identity, but his fingerprints revealed who he was beyond a shadow of a doubt. He was America's most wanted fugitive, Ted Bundy. The trial process in Florida turned into a full-blown media circus. It was one of the first major trials in America to be broadcast live on television, and Bundy intended to be the star of this stage. Once again, he fired his lawyers and represented himself. His demeanor in the courtroom was a summary of his narcissism. He acted like a calm, intelligent, charismatic law student, questioning witnesses and making legal objections. For a moment, there were even those who believed he might actually be innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. In particular, a bite mark left on the body of one of the victims at the Chi Omega sorority house played a key role in his conviction. Forensic experts proved that Bundy's crooked dental structure was a perfect match for the mark on the victim. This was groundbreaking forensic evidence for the time and completely shut the door on Bundy's denials. One of the most unforgettable moments of the trial was when Bundy, while defending himself, called Carol Derringe, one of the women he had abducted, but who had escaped, to the witness stand. As Bundy calmly questioned her, the fear and hatred in Carol's eyes affected everyone in the courtroom. Another bizarre moment came when he proposed to his ex-girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, who was testifying. During the case, Boone accepted thanks to an old Florida law. This declaration in open court was considered a legal marriage. Even while on trial for his life, Bundy was trying to exert control and create an illusion of a normal family. The outcome was inevitable. The jury found Bundy guilty of the Chi Omega murders and the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he was sentenced to death in 2 separate trials. As he delivered the sentence, Judge Edward Cowart spoke these historic words to Bundy: "You've committed extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile acts. It is a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity as I've seen in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way. Partner, take care of yourself. I don't have any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. But you go and we'll do our own lives." Bundy tried to delay his execution for years with appeals. During this time, he gave numerous interviews to psychologists, authors, and detectives. However, he only began to truly confess when his execution date was finally set. He described dozens of murders to detectives Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth in the third person, as if analyzing the crimes of another person, theorizing about their psychological motivations. Even this was a sign of how much he avoided taking responsibility in his final days. In an interview with Christian broadcaster Dr. James Dobson, he tried to attribute all his crimes to violent pornography. This was his final manipulative attempt to garner some sympathy from the public and to shift the responsibility for his own monstrosity onto something else. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy's final act came to a close. The front of the Florida State Prison was filled with hundreds of people gathered to celebrate his death. They set off fireworks and chanted, "Burn, Bundy, burn." When asked for his last words as he was strapped into the electric chair, Bundy turned to his lawyer and the minister and said, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Then, 2,000 volts of electricity was sent through his body, and one of America's most horrific serial killers was officially pronounced dead. The story of Ted Bundy is the anatomy of a monster in human form. He was a predator who slipped through the cracks of society, used trust as a weapon, and destroyed dozens of innocent lives for his own dark fantasies. His intelligence, charisma, and good looks were a mask that only made him more dangerous. So, what do you think? Despite being nearly caught multiple times, and even going to prison, why didn't Ted Bundy stop? What was the insatiable force that pushed him to kill more and more? Share your thoughts in the comments.